Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Catherine Ross, the Executive Director of the Center for Teaching and Learning. I want to thank you all for joining us today for this anti-racist pedagogy panel, co-sponsored by the Office of the Vice Provost for Faculty Advancement and the Center for Teaching and Learning. I am beyond delighted to introduce you to our guests who have graciously volunteered to share their teaching insights with all of you today. Tugce Bilgin is a lecturer in the Frontiers of Science Fellows Program at Columbia University. She is an evolutionary biologist from Istanbul, Turkey, and she is passionate about creating equal opportunities and empowering her students. Nicholas Bock is a lecturer in the discipline of Earth and Environmental Sciences and teaches in the Frontiers of Science Fellows Program at Columbia. And he has also taught high school biology in New York City. Latisha Hanson is an assistant professor of nursing and director of diversity programming at the Columbia School of Nursing at the Columbia University Irving Medical Campus. She also serves as the director of diversity programming with Columbia University School of Nursing's Office of Diversity and Cultural Affairs. Matthea Marquart is the assistant dean of online education and a senior adjunct lecturer at Columbia School of Social Work. She oversees the creation and co-facilitation of their award-winning Institute on Pedagogy and Technology for online courses, and she regularly collaborates on presentations and publications about student-centered, trauma-informed teaching and learning. Rochelle Mendonca is an assistant professor in the Occupational Therapy Program in the Department of Rehabilitation and Regenerative Medicine at the Columbia University Irving Medical Campus, where she also serves as the Director of Continuing Education. So welcome to our panelists. And I'm just going to take a minute and talk about how we're going to conduct our conversation today. As you may recall from the registration materials, I'm going to be posing 4 kind of big questions to our guests today. Our 5 panelists will each share their answers to these questions. And this conversation will probably take about an hour of our time together, like 15 minutes per question. At the end of that, we will begin to answer your questions that have come in through the Q&A box. Feel free to post your questions at any time during the panel conversation. Our moderators will be collecting and organizing them for panelist responses in the final 25 minutes or so remaining. So with that, let's jump right into our questions. So our first question, can you talk a little bit about how your pedagogy has changed and evolved since taking this anti-racist pedagogical stance? What does that look like for you and for your students? And what motivated you to make this change? And Latisha is going to just kick us off here.
Morning, everyone. Thank you. I had started anti-racist work even before the pandemic. I was fortunate enough to go to the same program that I'm working at. So I saw firsthand some ways that we could incorporate more diversity and inclusion into our education. We added in a dean, for example, that Dean Vivian Taylor for our Office of Diversity. And we also were able to work with a company called Tannenbaum that incorporated diversity into our curriculum. And I felt like we were making some progress. However, as we mentioned, once the pandemic and the movements that occurred resulting from racism impacted society, I felt like we needed to do more. And what I did by that was adding in more information into the courses that I was teaching. I do teach in 2 different programs. I teach for a pre-licensure program, and I also teach for a doctorate of nursing program. So I felt that we needed to have more spaces available for students to talk. There were initiatives on the campus outside of the classroom as well that helped not only for our pedagogy, but helped us to learn as faculty and instructors. So I also joined a number of the committees and organizations that were working on the campus. In regard to my pedagogy itself, I attended one of CTL's, the Center of Teaching and Learning's models from Dr. Inoue, in which he presented on understanding and doing anti-racist classroom assessment and labor-based grading. And that was one of the models that really profoundly changed how I taught. I began to look more at why I was teaching a particular topic and what I wanted my students to learn. And also being a provider and a faculty member of color, how this dynamic changed with the students. So some of the elements that I looked at was the purpose that Dr. Inoue brought up, the process. So understanding what course grade I'm giving. Is it based on a particular assessment? So for example, some of the courses, Dr. Inoue looked more at labor-based grading in terms of writing, but I was thinking more of how could we incorporate this also into our assessments in terms of the exams. So I looked at how I can change this, and I added in presentations, things that students could do remotely online. I also worked off the labor-based contract in terms of grading. In regard to parts, what was the textbook? What role did white language play in our textbook? How could we add in different elements in addition to the text in terms of articles and videos from people of color? And then also the place itself in terms of where students were learning, the people who were involved, the teaching assistants, the professors, the clinical instructors that we work at, the patients, and also the product. Was this a pass-fail class versus a class where we had individual grades and then where assignments group or individual assignments? So I added all these different elements and to change the way that learning was done for my course. Thank you.
Matthea, you want to pick up the thread?
Thank you, Catherine. And thanks to everybody for being here. I know we're all super busy and you're taking time out of your busy days to think about anti-racist pedagogy, which is an excellent first step or one of many steps. So I've been lucky to teach at the School of Social Work, which is extremely focused on social justice. So there's a lot of support and professional development around anti-racist teaching. And I've also been lucky to work with our online campus, where we've been having conversations about inclusive teaching for many years. And I've also benefited a lot from the CTL's trainings and events as well. So one evolution that I've experienced over time is that with the influence of the Black Lives Matter movement and other social movements, we've gotten more explicit about anti-racist pedagogy and countering toxic white supremacy. And all that intersects with inclusive teaching more broadly. So an example I'll share from my own teaching is around creating community agreements with my students. So these are basically class rules that we come up with during the first day of class, and then we commit to them and we revisit them every week. We recommit to them, maybe we edit them. And years ago, when I was doing this with students, I would start with pretty broad questions like, what agreements would you like to set as a class in order to feel more able to learn this semester together? And more recently, I've also started asking prompts that specifically focus on anti-racism. So for example, I might introduce a model for dealing with microaggressions that happen in class, and then ask the students if they'd like to include following this model in the community agreements. And I'll share in the chat a link to the model. Another evolution in my teaching that is that I more consciously make space to regularly reflect on anti-racist teaching. So one thing that the CTL is very good at encouraging is being very reflective in your teaching and just thinking back, how did class go? How could it be better next time? What can I do? And for me now, this also means specifically thinking about this from an anti-racist lens. So not just generally, but also in an anti-racist way. And then practically, that means making time for regular professional development, which we're going to talk about later. And then the most important thing is taking concrete steps in the classroom. And our online campus community has a poster with a lot of practical strategies for anti-racist online teaching, and I'll share a link in the chat. And one thing that I keep in mind is this context that we're in here at Columbia. So at Columbia, we're all immersed in an old institution founded in 1754. Until very recently, this was an institution just for white men. So according to the Columbia University and Slavery Project, African-American students were rare until about the 1920s. And for undergrads, there weren't any women at all, let alone women of color, admitted to Columbia College until 1983, which that's my lifetime. So that blows me away. So what this means for my teaching is that I need to be conscious that if I'm not making an active effort, racism is going to sneak in. So as Ibram Kendi has said, there's no checkbox that lets you say, okay, well, I'm done. I'm an anti-racist educator. Now I don't have to think about it anymore. It's an action verb. It's something that you have to keep doing over time. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Matthea. 1983, really? Okay. All right, Nicholas, I think you're up next.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. And thanks so much to everyone else for joining today. Really looking forward to the discussion. I guess my own personal evolution toward anti-racist pedagogy began with my work as a high school teacher, where I would enter a high school classroom here at a public school in New York City, very much a sort of cultural outsider, and really required a lot of thought about how to remove myself from the center of the classroom and try to leverage the diversity that existed within the classroom to get everyone toward whatever specific learning goals they might be expected to master, whether for the class itself or for the Regents exam or something like that. And then I think sort of in concert with my experiences going up to I worked up at Lamont as a PhD student for a number of years, and it was really you see this really stark contrast between the diversity and the cultural composition, or the demographic composition of the high school classrooms and the composition of the people that were on the shuttle going up to Lamont. And you really got a really good view of sort of how lossy the pipeline is from elementary school to university or graduate school for so many of these students. And so that really inspired me to think more actively, or see it not so much as just a matter of teaching to the diversity that is in the classroom, but thinking about how to try to push or inspire some sort of change to increase the amount of diversity that exists in the classroom. That in concert with all the events of 2020 and the George Floyd protests helped me realize that it was something that had to be done intentionally and explicitly in the classroom. So from that, I think my evolution through and continued thinking about anti-racist pedagogy has mostly occurred within the context of the Frontiers of Science course. It's taken a couple of different forms, again, really constantly reflecting in my planning, in my teaching, sort of thinking about how a lesson went on any given day, about how I'm imposing my own cultural values in the way that I'm presenting content, whether I'm providing opportunities for students to bring their own interests and their own priorities, their own values into the classroom. What additional opportunities might exist to increase the opportunities for students to bring their voice into the classroom. That just might look like developing new activities, replacing sort of a lecture with an inquiry-based activity where students take a more active role in their learning. Then thinking about how I can encourage conversations about diversity within the university, about inequities and diversity in the sciences, and the power structures that exist within scientific research and that kind of thing. And a lot of this has been done sort of on my own, but then a massive part has involved collaborating with other instructors on in the Frontiers of Science faculty. Together we started a discussion group last semester to regularly come together and read texts related to anti-racist pedagogy and inclusive pedagogy and reflect on how those might inform our own practices. And that's just been hugely influential in my own thinking and getting perspectives of other instructors as well. Anyway, So that's sort of, yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Nick. Rochelle?
Thank you, everyone. It's such a great discussion, and I think we all struggle with the same kinds of issues, no matter which profession we're teaching in. So I'm an occupational therapist and teach in the occupational therapy program. So, part of our journey is how we teach in the classroom, but then also how we prepare students to walk out into the world and deal with all of these issues on a daily basis. We are, as a profession, a very white profession and a very white girl profession. That's what we are known as. So we've struggled with diversity in the profession for many, many years, not just bringing students in, but also making the students who are diverse and minorities who do come in feel like they belong and feel like they're welcome in a profession that's very white dominated. And that starts in the classroom. And, we struggle with that, but that never really came to the forefront until 2020, when everything, the world exploded. And a lot of us felt very unprepared in the classroom with how to deal with the emotions that our students were experiencing, and forced us to rethink how we teach, right from the literature we use, which again is very white dominated. We don't have a lot of literature that's diverse, with the examples that are brought into the classroom, with the contextual influences we provide around health. Why certain races are just not more prone to certain diseases. A lot of it is social. A lot of it is demographic. A lot of it is opportunities that people have in life that might make them prone to certain conditions or not. And also, my biggest discovery was letting go in the classroom and recognizing that I might not have all the answers. And sometimes the students have actually lived through situations that they can speak better to than I can. It actually, I think for me, was a discovery. To recognize that students are their own support sometimes. They can help understand or help others understand situations better than I can, because I may not have lived through them. So for many years, and this was even pre-George Floyd, I always do, I used to teach an introductory level occupational therapy class where I do what I called a bias activity, where I had students take implicit and explicit bias assessment tests, provide the results to them, and then have a discussion in the classroom about what their biases are. And I never picked on specific students. I did it as a class. And there were always certain biases that came to the forefront, right? Biases against Blacks and African Americans, biases against Muslims, biases about going into certain neighborhoods or certain types of demographics where students were like, well, we might not want to work in those demographics, but that's life and that's health, and we provide health care to everybody irrespective of where you're coming from. The conversation changed significantly for me from pre-2020 to post-2020. And post-2020, the students were a lot more explicit and willing to be explicit about what some of their biases were, how that impacted them emotionally, and what it meant for them to recognize that there might be students in the class who are biased against me. And the openness of that conversation, I think, changes who they become as healthcare professionals. So in addition to what everybody else talked about, that was just one thing I wanted to add in about what, how my pedagogy changed and how I changed in trying to teach in this anti-racist world. Thank you.
Thanks, Rochelle. And last but certainly not least, Tugce.
Thank you. It was so nice to hear from everyone, and I'm looking forward to the answers of the other questions as well, because like everyone is coming from a different background and everyone has different approaches to this very similar issue we're trying to tackle. To me, I come from Turkey, and they're already seeing a lot of inequalities. I was already having some activities. I organize every year an evolutionary genomics school for students, and with the fellow teachers, we always get funds to make it completely free. And this was my first effort actually to get into this and feel how important the efforts to bring equal opportunities to students, to see how much it was appreciated by the students. I moved to New York in 2018, and the first workplace I worked was in Brooklyn College. It was within a program for underserved students. I gave a coding class, and it was my first encounter with students coming from such underserved backgrounds. And this, of course, opened my eyes to many other issues. I began to read, inform myself, etc. But it was again the pandemic time that made things shift for me, but it actually shifted things in me in a little bit of a more personal way. I would like to share my very own personal story. So I miss one hand. I am born with one hand only. And I think until that summer, I always had this mentality that I can do anything. I don't miss anything. I am complete as I am, even if, it was, of course, a struggle, but, who is going to admit it? I thought the right thing to do is always to say, I am doing it well. I don't need any help. But that summer, from a very personal aspect, I could not bike in the city. I could not use the public transport. So I decided, okay, I know how to bike, but I don't trust my body to bike in the city setting. And I looked into it, and I developed myself an adapter to fit my bike so that I could insert my hand in that adapter so that I could have this straight alignment on the bike that would give me the confidence and stability on the bike. Why is this important? Because it made me cry so hard and realize that I actually am a human being who is in need of things. We are all unequal in different ways. And we have privileges in some ways, and we have things that we are challenged in some other ways. And it's so important to accept those things and not be ashamed of them, not bury them deep down. And this was my point to, I think, welcome so many other changes. And this was the time I also began to get more seriously involved in anti-racist pedagogy. I first participated as a book club that we were reading. This was my first encounter with bell hooks, for example, and contract-based grading, for example. So I began to read and learn so many things, and of course began to implement those things in my classes too. This was the time I also began to implement community agreements in my classroom. I'm so glad, impressed actually that Matthea was doing it so many years ago. So this is, I think, my story of the evolution and my entrance into the anti-racist pedagogy.
Thank you so much, Tugce. Very powerful story. Thank you for sharing that. I'm going to move on to the second question so I don't want to have to skip any of our questions for time. So the second question, there are agreed upon underpinnings and values that are embedded in anti-racist pedagogy, but you all teach very different classes and topics. So these values have to be enacted in disciplinary, appropriate, and very specific ways. So how have you made those decisions, and what has that process looked like? And we'll go back to Latisha.
So when I first heard this question, I started thinking about the importance behind the work that we do. And I try to incorporate anti-racist elements in all the classes I teach. But I do recognize that within my specialty, psychiatric nursing, that there are some programs that I teach for example, my pre-licensure program for the Master's Direct Entry program. I only have 5 weeks to teach a cohort a topic that they may never have again in their life. And I want them to go forth and be nurses that can use therapeutic communication, can be culturally competent, and to be able to have humility and to work with people to reduce the racism that we're seeing that patients experience today. So it was a challenge to incorporate the way I wanted to. I do make sure, for example, that every class we have some discussion about bias, about discrimination, about social determinants of health, about how history played a role. But I feel my doctoral classes where I have a whole semester, I have more time for discussion. I have more time, and I still do it with my other classes too, but I feel like I'm not rushed as much. The other aspect is several cohorts that I teach, they have boards that they have to take or pre-licensure exams. So I'm also tasked with having to have a certain amount of material that students may need to know in order to pass those licensing exams. But I try to make sure that though it may not be something that they're tested on, that it's something that they learn to appreciate. So I've done that through writing. I've done it through group work. When we went to remote teaching, one way that I had not incorporated before was the use of small groups. Nothing could move groups around like Zoom. So I could make multiple groups throughout like one of my courses, the one that's 5 weeks, we have 5 hours. So it's a long day too on top of that. So it made the learning process better. And I think it enabled students to work together. Students of color that may not have had their voices heard before or felt like they could meet other students were able to meet students using that platform. And then returning to class, I've tried to maintain some of that with the attendance by having them go around the room to talk about ways that they use for their own healing, ways that they use for their own coping. So in addition to learning about each other, I think they're taking forth ways that they could work with their patients. In regard to the pedagogy itself, I understood the Dr. Inoue, when he looked at the labor-based grading, it was mostly with writing, but I was tasked with trying to put this into a way where quizzes and exams could utilize it. And I found by making collaborative exams was an excellent way of taking the focus off the individual and making it more towards a group and using courseworks for these type of quizzes and assessments where there's multiple attempts. And lastly, I also pre-recorded my lectures. So if anyone was sick, they'd have the opportunity, or if anyone had other things that obligations that they were going through, they would not miss out to make learning more inclusive.
Great. Thank you. Just keep going, Matthea.
All right.
I
thank you.
won't call you each time. Just keep going.
Great. So I think one thing that I'm really enjoying here is seeing this theme that's already emerging about how universal anti-racist pedagogy is and how it fits into many disciplines and how important it is for teaching overall. So thinking about social work is all about social justice at the micro, meso, and macro levels, meaning social work education covers a lot of topics. For example, I've taught clinical skills courses, and I've taught courses related to leadership and management and courses in between. Also, our professional code includes values such as social justice, integrity, and dignity and worth of the person. And our profession's grand challenges include eliminating racism. So anti-racist teaching is very much in line with our profession. And this means that when we're using anti-racist pedagogy, one thing that we can do that is maybe a little bit unique to social work, but I think applies probably to many other disciplines, is that we can also zoom out to consider how students might use a particular anti-racist practice with their clients as well. So we can model for them. There's something in social work that we call parallel practice. So what you're learning, you're also going to be applying. As social workers, we also have a focus on trauma-informed and strengths-based teaching, and that overlaps a lot with anti-racist pedagogy. And I thought for this question, I would focus here because it fits in with Kishimoto's point about anti-racist teaching being about how you teach, and also Asaoe Inoi's point from his CTL workshop about how anti-racist teaching includes being compassionate and collaborative with students. So trauma-informed teaching principles include physical, emotional, social, and academic respect, trustworthiness and transparency, support and connection, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, voice and choice, cultural, historical, and gender context, and resilience, growth, and change. And anti-racism really fits in with all those principles. So for example, if something major happens in the news and you feel like you need to address it with the class, because nobody's going to be able to concentrate on your class unless you address it or acknowledge that something happened. A trauma-informed use of empowerment, voice, and choice might mean giving students a choice about how much time they'd like to spend checking in, or if they want to step away during that check-in period. And also giving students a choice about who is doing the talking. So for example, if something happens that impacts a particular racial group, we're not pointing to the student who represents that racial group and saying like, please represent your entire race now. It's if they would like to say something, then, they're welcome to, but if students don't want to say something, they can be quiet and really give them the empowerment to be able to do what's best for them. So if you do that in class, then a social work instructor might point out, okay, so when you're meeting with clients, you can give your clients a choice about if they want to jump right into a meeting or if they want to take some time to check in first, just on a personal level. And another example might be giving students input into an assignments grading rubric, which is something I started doing actually after a CTL workshop a few years ago. And this fits in with the trauma-informed principle of collaboration and mutuality. So a social work instructor might present a rubric to students and say, how does this work with the assignment? Would you change anything? Do you feel like this would be a fair way to grade this assignment? And then they could point out to the students that in the future, when they're doing staff evaluations, for example, they could involve that person in kind of figuring out what's important to assess. So those are a couple examples of kind of social work specific things, but I do think they're more universal as well.
Cool.
Nick?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Sorry for the delay. And so, yeah, as a science instructor, as a STEM instructor, I feel like I usually end up thinking about it as sort of thinking about it two different components, right? On one hand, you have sort of in-class practices that can contribute or to more active student participation in their own learning. And that's relatively straightforward. Of the two problems, the second problem being, how to explicitly address issues of race and inequality within the science classroom. Of those two problems, of those two challenges, finding ways to promote student or active learning is the far easier one. It's fairly straightforward to think of activities where students can, for example, collect, organize, interpret data sets, engage collaboratively to build their understanding of whatever objectives they might be targeting. And then downstream of that, introducing assessments that allow for sort of more authentic ways for students to demonstrate their mastery of those objectives. That feels fairly straightforward, by no means easy, but fairly straightforward. The much larger challenge is in trying to find ways to explicitly address issues around race and cultural inequities within STEM. And I feel like that's the piece that you're really trying to get at with anti-racist pedagogy specifically. And sometimes, just thinking over the last year for the Frontiers of Science, those opportunities have emerged organically. So I think, for instance, last semester we had a discussion about the history of the Manhattanville campus and the university use amendment domain to acquire the land that the Manhattanville campus is now situated on. What's the history there? Who was displaced? Who is there now? How does that reflect larger imbalances in power structures in science or between science and society at large. Other times there have been texts that have just been spotted that have perfectly dovetailed by combining an anti-racist view with content specific to whatever unit we're working on. So for instance, a text written by a non-white author or a non-white researcher who can speak specifically to their experience in STEM in a way that I would not be able to. But then other times it's a lot more difficult. And I feel like that's sort of an ongoing process. That's something that I'm just sort of working through semester after semester. It's the main motivation, at least for me, for participating in the discussion groups that we've been having amongst the Frontiers of Science faculty to try to identify where those opportunities exist and try to make sure that we're able to take advantage of those opportunities as they come up, and that we're able to help others take advantage of those opportunities when they come up. But yeah, it's a work in progress. And yeah, I'll stop there.
So just to add to, I think, what everybody's doing, I think we all have some certain things that we are all doing. Matthea, I love your thoughts around offering students opportunities to be part of the process and not just giving them the process or the protocols that we think are appropriate. I'm very fortunate to be part of a fabulous program where everybody's invested in this. And I think that helps make things a little easier across our program, where we all decide about how we are going to approach some of these situations. Like Matthea, like you said, one of the things that we decided early on, several years ago, actually, was to offer students the opportunity when things are happening around the world to process and and even if they don't want to process, to just offer quiet time at the beginning of every day to whoever the first instructor of that day was to offer quiet time to the students to either reflect openly or to just take the time and reflect privately on what was happening, and allowing them to process in whatever way they felt comfortable with. And we've been doing that for about 2 years now within our program daily. But two other things that, as everyone was talking, that came up to me is assessment, especially across programs. And there are several of us here who have to take standardized assessments for students to get registered or licensed. And there's a lot of literature out there about how these standardized assessments in themselves are biased. And I would love to say that we could change the world and, change the way these standardized assessments are administered, because we know they are not necessarily reflective of who the person or the practitioner is. And unfortunately, within our programs and our teaching, we do have to prepare students to take these assessments and pass them and become licensed practitioners. And so part of our process within our program was how do we, yes, prepare the students to do that, but also offer them different ways of providing or demonstrating that they are going to be the practitioner they are prepared to be. I'm a big proponent of universal design of learning, and I've used it for about 10 years now in every way, in every course that I take or every course I teach. And one of my processes is that 50% of my assignments are going to be standardized in the way that they need to take their exams at the end of their programs, but 50% of my assessments are giving the students the opportunity to provide the assignment in any way they want, whether it is an audio recording, whether it's a comic book strip, whether it's a video that they want to turn in, or whether it's a paper, because that's the way they feel most prepared to demonstrate their learning. And so that's just the way I have always done it, but become more aware that, this is actually helping students who might not be the greatest writers, not because they're not good writers, but because they've never learned how to write, and giving them the opportunity to show that they've learned everything they need to know about that topic in a different way. So I'm going to end there, and Tugce, allow you to take on.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, listening to what everyone else does, it feels both familiar, but also there is so much to learn from each other as well. So it's such a nice opportunity to listen to each other's techniques in that sense. And as we were discussing in the previous question, we are all evolving with every year, every experience, right? To me, like when I read this question first, I thought of the importance of bringing in all these elements, like maybe activities to create the community feeling in the class, whether this is like creating a community agreement or doing the group work. But this type of things are so important whatever class we teach. And I was giving a talk on the community agreements 2 weeks ago in Pratt Institute, where I also teach. And there I received this question, but like community agreement it wouldn't really fit in with what I teach. And this has actually no relevance, I was thinking. So how important to use these elements in our classrooms, whatever they are going to help us to create the community. I was also thinking, especially if listening to you, Rochelle, am I pronouncing your name correctly? Okay, good. How important it is to keep everything we teach to our students relevant to them. Like Nick, I also teach a Frontiers of Science course, 2 sections of them. And we have students who are coming from all different majors because it's a required course. And it makes you question, some students will come with a lot of knowledge in science, some students will not come with a lot of knowledge in science, right? So there is a lot of inequality in that sense there, which is rooted in including racist and classist and many other types of inequalities that comes from their background. So it is important to find ways of assessments. It is important to find ways of activating the students that will kind of give them more equal opportunities, and keeping things relevant to them is important. Asking questions, I try to use this technique a lot. For example, asking questions with no right answer, but rather asking students to come up with their own answer so that they feel like engaged with it is important. We had in the course, I have a nice example. During the pandemic time in the first semester, when we turned online, we were thinking how to do our exams. And we had this idea that to ask the students, to each of them, okay, look at your community, wherever you live, your city, your county, or even larger scale, depending on where you come from, and see how many COVID cases you see, how many deaths you see, and which measures are being taken, are they working, why or why not. So kind of giving the students the tools first so that they can actually deliver these things, but then making sure that they use whatever is relevant for them, I think makes a big difference for students, because then they all are more open to take it. And this way it gives us the opportunity to be able to assess in a more equal environment as well, I feel like. And there was also one thing, because I'm the last one to talk, I can always borrow elements from you. Matthea said the trauma-informed approaches, I think, and I began to include that also a lot in my teachings. I'm also a yoga teacher, and I like to read a lot, how we can deal with trauma in our bodies. And I try to bring that element into the classroom as well by maybe addressing that in the beginning, like we are all as physical bodies here in this classroom, and you may be bringing in your traumas with you and showing flexibilities whenever is needed. I don't know whether that's like extending a deadline or I don't know, excusing some things, being understanding, but that I was very happy when you mentioned trauma. Also, yeah, I think that's all. Thank you.
Before I jump into question 3, I just want to remind our guests today to please post your questions in the Q&A box, not in the chat. So keep them coming. All right, now back to our panelists. How have the students responded to your pedagogical approach? Have you faced challenges or resistance? And if so, how have you navigated that?
I think overall, going off of the theme that we have with trauma, that was also a challenge that we faced, where students that, especially students of color, the BIPOC students, when we discussed things that were happening, it was almost a bit of re-traumatization for them. So I think we needed to allot time to process what was happening in class. And I also provided spaces outside of the class for the students if they felt they needed more, because I didn't want them to feel rushed if there was a topic that was brought up, or we used a discussion board in courseworks to continue on, or if students felt like they couldn't speak amongst the peers, we advised that we would be available. So I also made myself available, but I brought up about student wellness during that time and the burnout rate for providers, the high suicide rate during the pandemic. And we talked about how trauma was impacting them. So I just wanted to bring that up also in regard to the approach that we took. Overall, students want more. They want more anti-racist work. They're calling for ongoing work. They don't want to end. They want to see that this is incorporated at multiple levels. But there are some pieces I think that are harder. For example, for us systemically, it's been challenging with like the electronic medical record at labs that hold on to old values like EGFR, and they kind of perpetuate racism. And the textbooks that haven't changed, and as some of us mentioned about the exams. So the wording and the white terminology that's used for exams. So I think the way around that has been using other resources or resources that we make ourselves. And students have really welcomed that ability to be a part of the lecture and to have their own kind of like their own say in how they're taught. In regards to faculty, time has been an issue. I think some faculty feel a little more discomfort when we say conflict. And we're starting a conversation in class with like bystander awareness and discrimination. How do you respond when it comes up in class? Could be a challenge. So what we've done is incorporate workshops, trainings. I also have faculty forums that I'll hold spaces for faculty to discuss how they worked with incorporating anti-racist conversations in class or how they did it within their curriculum. But I think cancel culture played a big play for fear of what will happen if I make a mistake. And then I think overall with the students in regard to labor-based grading, some students held on to wanting to be competitive and wanting to be like the perfect student. And it was harder for them to do collaborative learning. So some feedback that I had got was they felt like they wanted more time for themselves to shine. They were still striving for that A, and it was hard for them to let go. So some of them come from privilege, and I could understand why they were bringing forth that feedback by, holding on to individualism and competitiveness. But overall, it has been well received by the School of Nursing and the classes that I've taught.
So I'd like to build on what you're saying about it actually being a little bit harder sometimes for instructors. I've found, and I think lots of folks here have said, that students are welcoming the anti-racist pedagogy. They appreciate the techniques that we're using. And it's actually a little bit harder for instructors because it requires self-reflection, learning new skills, challenging ourselves, being vulnerable. I see some of the Q&A coming in is about if you're an instructor and you make a mistake, and that is a hard feeling to grapple with. And just addressing that, it's one thing that I think about is if you think about toxic white supremacy culture, one characteristic of it is perfectionism. So if you let go of perfectionism or embrace mistakes or learning from failure, that's actually anti-racist. So giving yourself permission to make mistakes and not be perfect is anti-racist. And that even is something to that may be helpful in framing this. So I'm just thinking back, when I saw this question, I was thinking back to my first class that I taught as an adjunct. And as an adjunct, this is before I was an administrator at the school. So I felt fear and pressure around student feedback evaluations at the end of the semester. I knew that administrators would look at them. I also had heard all these horror stories about student biases playing out in evaluations, women getting lower evaluations, instructors of color getting lower evaluations. And I heard these horror stories about instructors who actually did what we want them to do, which is bring in anti-racist discussions into the classroom, but then students who felt uncomfortable with that took revenge on them in feedback evaluations. So there was a lot of fear there. And then also being at an Ivy League, there's this pressure. You have to cover the content. You have to get through all the slides. And I have found that there's these biases, and Catherine, your Dead Ideas in Teaching and Learning podcast gets at this, but there's biases around like, what is good teaching? Like people think about, oh, it's a old white man who stands in front of the room and lectures. That is the pinnacle of university teaching. And so kind of dealing with that. I'm not an old white man. I'm a woman of color, and I was a young woman of color when I started teaching. And I had to grapple with that. So there was that it's challenging more from the instructor perspective, I would say. So I was nervous about student resistance, but that never really happened. So, I had amazing students who were very receptive to anti-racist pedagogy. And also I focus on building community with my class. I think that it's really important for students to be able to be active learners and active participants in their learning, to feel some comfort with taking risks in the class. And I don't think you can feel comfortable taking risks unless you've built community. So I think that that's really essential and enhances learning. And if you're using class time for community building, it can be connected to the course content. So you can activate prior knowledge about the course topic by asking students to share their prior experiences with a particular topic. And that builds community because we're learning about each other, but it's also relevant to the course content and it supports learning. And you can do kind of more fun stuff before class starts or after class or during the breaks or something like that. There's a lot of ways you can build in community time without sacrificing instructional time. And in fact, it enhances instructional time. So the resistance or the challenge hasn't really been so much from students, but it's an internal challenge for instructors, I think. And folks here are expressing that a little bit in the Q&A. And I just want to encourage everybody, I have an administrator hat as well. And I'll say administrators know about these biases that show up in student evaluations. And I know Catherine's done a lot of work around student evaluations and how we can make the whole process better for everyone involved. But try, it's hard because it's so ingrained, especially at high level institutions, but letting go of perfectionism, that is anti-racist. So letting go of that can be a great first step.
Yeah, I think just to follow on what other folks have said so far, and thinking back to our response to the last question, I feel like student perceptions are hugely influenced by what you choose to prioritize on assessments. And I feel like that's sort of where a big piece of the challenge is. So for example, in teaching high school, at the end of the year, students always had to take the biology regents exam. And the biology regents exam was one of the exams that they had to pass in order to graduate from high school. And so there would be this real tension about structuring classroom time, around activities or versions of existing activities that I felt might provide students more authentic opportunity to participate in science. Then at the end of the day, if those didn't help them achieve a better score or get a better score on the regents, I would really question myself on whether or not I was doing the right thing, whether or not that was actually a service to the students that I was working with, if it in fact did not lead directly to improved regent scores, because the regents was a non-negotiable. So to what extent am I sort of, I guess, pushing my own priorities and perceptions of what good science education looks like onto students at the expense of their ability to pass this really important exam? And I feel like the logical thing to do would be to get rid of the regents, but that's totally outside of certainly my control, any individual school's control. So you sort of have to operate in that space. And so I guess in my experience, students haven't pushed back on trying to incorporate, when I've tried to incorporate these kind of learning activities, or when I've tried to encourage these kind of conversations in classrooms. I think, like everyone else has said, they're conversations that students really want to have. The time that I do find out about it is on evaluations, when students feel like they weren't well prepared for the exam. To borrow directly from evaluation from I think last semester, terms like wasted our time have come up. If we're spending our time having these conversations, and if students perceive that time being spent having those conversations instead of preparing them for the exam that they have to take, then I think there's pushback. And unfortunately, that pushback comes at a time when I can no longer really directly respond to it. And so sort of all I can do is to sort of like take that, think about how to do better next time. But yeah.
I agree 100% with everything everyone is saying. I think students want more. We've never, at least I've never experienced a student not wanting to have more opportunities to have these discussions. And we're trying to do some of it in our program. And Matthea, completely right. I think time from a faculty member's perspective is the biggest struggle. We, however, like I've said, have a faculty who's very invested in this. And so, we've started things like book clubs with students, where it's done outside of class time, where faculty and students all read, the same book, and then whoever has the time and ability comes and discusses the books we're reading, all seminal books around anti-racism. We have a student chapter for DEI and justice on, in our program, where there's monthly discussions, activities, initiatives, activism from the students' perspective. I think, again, the struggle, Matthea, like you mentioned, is from the faculty perspective, right? Change your PowerPoints around to be anti-racist, change the types of questions you have on your exams to be anti-racist, talk about more opportunities for discussion in the classroom, but then what do we do when we can't cover the subject material? Struggling with all of those pieces, which we keep telling ourselves it's a one-time thing. If you fix it the first time, then, it's something that will perpetuate and will make life easier later on. But that's not really the gist of anti-racism, right? We have to be changing constantly and every year. And it's an internal change, and it's a change that we as instructors have to just accept is something we have to do as part of being faculty members, and that takes time. So just saying, we do what we can, and that's kind of the route our program's taking. Let's even if you change 10 questions on the exam, that's better than 0 questions in the exam. So let's start there. And we've all been doing that. So some of us, if there are new courses, completely brand new courses, we're starting from scratch and just making sure we are incorporating anti-racist principles into everything we're developing, and courses that have been offered for a while, saying that, let's do 10% this year and 20% next year, and, figure it out as we go. But one of the things we're also doing is communicating that to students and saying that we're doing it and you'll see it, but it might not be everything. And, feel free to let us know when we're doing things wrong, but also give us, the opportunity to be humans and make errors. So that's, that's where we are in our program.
I also had the same situation with Nick, where I think twice it happened to me. One was a year ago when I had dedicated like half time of my class to discussing about scientists like if they are women, if they're coming from different sexual orientations or different genders, how are they perceived in the society, which women scientists do we know, etc. Like, it was a very lengthy and nice discussion, and actually many students enjoyed. But then one of them actually commented like, oh, there was so unnecessary and much time dedicated to that. And I was like, okay. And then once also happened last semester, I got into a little bit Michel Foucault and what is normal, what is not normal, who defines what is normal in the society. It was the time when we were talking about p-values, and I was telling them p-value threshold is totally arbitrary. And I actually came from that angle, and I could see many students got excited about the idea. Oh yeah, who makes the decisions in the society? Questioning things. But then again, there was one student who commented about that. It happens. I think I didn't feel bad, or I just didn't think that I need to change what I do, because it is worth to keep those discussions, I think. But it is important to also this is actually making ourselves vulnerable, right? I tell the story I shared with you in the beginning, not in the beginning, but like in the first month of the class, always to my students about myself, because I value to be vulnerable. And when you make yourself vulnerable, and then you of course take risks, and of course some of those risks will have some consequences, which is all right. Which brings me to a concept I introduced to my students since this semester. I have participated in the summer in an educator course in the big art museums of New York. I really like getting inspirations from different fields, and one of them is art, because art educators, I find some of them are very open-minded and they can be very progressive. And I have once taken an online course, which I really took a lot of points and lessons from there. And this time I actually went into a 5-day in-person course. And there I learned about this very interesting concept. We always talk about safe space, creating a safe space, which is also creating community, right? But then the other thing is about taking risks, as Matthea was saying. And you take risks when you create a space that is also brave. So it is important to actually create a space that is first safe, but also brave, so that students find the space to grow in it, find a space to challenge themselves, challenge each other, so that we can all grow together, whether this challenge is about the content or it is about how, well we are behaving, how we are trying to make ourselves free of our biases. That will depend on how we lead the classes, obviously. I try to kind of keep it in a balance, both like content, but also the aspect of human in it. So that's why I value so much the vulnerability aspect of it. And that's why when we receive pushback from either students, from the other instructors department, or from ourselves, I'm like, I will keep myself vulnerable to that, and I will continue working on it. So that's my approach to this question.
Thank you, Tugce. I'll just very quickly say that when I interviewed some undergraduate students at the end of the spring semester 2020, one of the things we were talking about their learning experiences through the pandemic. And one of the things they said was it was the first time they had seen professors vulnerable, because everyone was thrown into this and had to learn. And they found that they were able to develop much stronger relationships with their professors at that point. So a little anecdotal evidence to support what you're saying. All right, so it is now 1:06. So I will ask question 4, but this is going to be sort of like speed dating. You've already answered some of you've given a lot of advice, so I think we've done really well on that. But do you want to just mention quick, like a couple kinds of personal or professional development that you participated in that really helped you build out? You just mentioned one, Tugce, so we've done a little bit of that, but any other shout outs for a particular development opportunity as you thought through your anti-racist practices?
It has been great to have CTL and have the workshops and trainings that they offer. It's been so valuable to be able to hear from guest speakers, to learn how to include assessment and different learning strategies. So I take advantage of the CTL workshops whenever I can. On the medical campus, we have an anti-racist education institute called ARI, and it's a group of disciplines where we all work together and share resources, and we went through a course together. So I think working together has helped us in that professional development. In addition to, there's also grants that you can apply for. So we had applied for a Provost grant, and we did a case for designing anti-racist case studies. And we worked with Michelle Hall in coming up with a rubric to try to reduce the amount of racism that is being used in cases. Committees at your university. My school has a committee for anti-racist education. In Rebecca Roop, had made a toolkit so that faculty can analyze their course. So I think there's such great faculty in the school that I work at, and everyone has come together to create these type of rubrics. In addition, we also have guest speakers that we've brought in, like Dr. Kendi, Beverly Tatum. We just had Mr. Curtis Zunaga from the Lenape tribe come to talk about and cherish some of the indigenous peoples in the community of the Lenape. So we also added a land acknowledgement statement at our school. We had Dr. Sharon Washington bring courses to the classes, to students and also to faculty. And lastly, I would say conferences like NADOHE, the National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Education. They had like writing across curriculum, and they brought a number of guest speakers to their conferences. So I found like this community approach has been really helpful.
I will echo that community approach, and I think that's something that has been a theme today. Tugce, you were talking about, learning from a community in your summer professional development, and Rochelle, it sounds like your department is so collaborative and figures out ways to work together. Nicholas, you talked about the Frontiers of Science faculty all collaborating, and for me, that's a big one. So I really try to do professional development that's tapping into my communities. The CTL is amazing. Latisha, I second everything you said about that. There's so many amazing resources, not just events, but also the podcast and the website. There's so many things that you can use there. And with my adjunct hat, I'll just say, you don't have to spend any money to work on this. So the Columbia Library has so many books that you can access as free ebooks. The CTL's events and offerings are all free. If you want to connect with the School of Social Work, on my handout link, I've got the link to be able to join our mailing list. We have a lot of public offerings, and many of them are free as well. So that's, I guess my shout out is, reach out to your community, go to the CTL events when you can, come to other schools' events. Columbia University has so many resources and just so many opportunities to connect with each other. And then on a personal level, talking with colleagues, I've just learned so much from my School of Social Work online campus colleagues. Everyone's got such wisdom and vulnerability and willingness to share with each other. And the peer learning and peer accountability aspects have just been so essential. So that's something that has been really valuable to me. And I'll shout out one specific CTL resource, and that's Frank Tuitt's keynote from this year's symposium, where he was pointing out that anti-racist pedagogy is going to benefit your teaching overall. It's going to benefit all your students. It's going to reduce barriers to learning. So it is time and effort, and it is ongoing. It's not like you just do it once and then you're set for the rest of your teaching, but it really is worth that time and effort.
So yeah, I would like to shout out the CTL as well. There are things that I do every class period that come directly from participating in the anti-racist pedagogy workshop at the beginning of the spring semester last year. So that's fantastic, and it's been a fantastic resource. And then I'd really like to echo the theme around collaboration. And so I think aside from these sort of one-off workshop, one-off events, as useful as they are, the thing that has really been the most informative and the most impactful for me has been having opportunities to talk with other instructors. So the Frontiers of Science faculty has been especially great for that, just because it brings together so many different perspectives from across so many different areas of expertise that in a very practical way. It's been extremely useful for identifying resources and different in-class things to try. But then getting to the idea of the brave space, it's only through collaboration or just talking with others that you can have your own sort of blind spots and biases highlighted, or that you can identify your own biases and blind spots, that you can have your biases and blind spots challenged, and that you can really grow in trying to implement anti-racist pedagogy in your own classroom. And so that really can't be done in isolation. So there is a piece of advice for other instructors interested in incorporating anti-racist pedagogy. That would probably be my first suggestion, is to find a group of like-minded faculty and start talking about it and just thinking about it, and accepting that, the process of that conversation is going to evolve in its own. And it is a process instead of just sort of a one-off event. But anyway, that's those are my thoughts, just listening to everyone else's suggestions.
And I'm going to take a minute, but I agree completely. CTL is fabulous. I think, the number of offerings, the variety of offerings, the timings of offerings, everything works for us, and we just have to make the time to go to them. Like Latisha, I was also part of the Anti-Racist Educators Institute and on the medical campus. And there's also, for everybody who attends that institute, there's a monthly meeting that the medical campus hosts for, everybody who was part of that institute are interested in learning more. And that's our community where we talk about it. And my second community is my program. We once a month we either host a speaker or activities related to anti-racist education, and then spend some time talking about how we would implement them within our program, courses, exams, and just student community is about how we talk to students and how we feel comfortable talking about uncomfortable topics. So, that's I agree, community and CDL, that's the way to go.
I echo everyone. It's community CTL, and maybe one thing I wanted to note, when I started working at the Pratt, they also have a developed department on DEI, but what they were missing is those grants that you give for inclusion and diversity efforts, like what Nick is describing. We got that grant together to have these discussions with our students. So I think anything that will support it at a systematic level is also very much welcome. It is definitely an individual work to connect to other people, form your communities, learn from each other, learn from students even, but also if the departments, if the institutions can also support these efforts at a systematic level, I think only then we can actually shine, we can actually thrive.
Well, thank you for this incredible conversation. You've given us so much to think about. It's 1:15, so I'm going to turn to the questions. Let's see, I will just start with the first one. And I think what I'll do is just ask maybe one person or two people to respond to each question so we can get through more of them. So I will let you raise your hand or volunteer to answer a question if it resonates with you. How's that work? All right. I am struck by how the 2020 uprisings have profoundly shaped your work. I'm wondering if that suggests a need to support and cultivate student activism on and off campus. What are some ways you are currently supporting activism, and how does that feed back into your work? Anyone want to try that one? Matthea.
This is a great question, and it's going to tie back into what we've been talking about as well about assessment. So in social work, one of the foundational or generalist courses is a course on advocacy. So it's something that we teach students about as part of the coursework. And one recent focus of advocacy has been the social work licensing exam pass rates. The pass rates by race were recently released thanks to advocacy efforts from New York State schools of social work deans and many, many others. And so now that we see the racial disparities in the pass rates, we're struck, there's two things we got to do. We've got to acknowledge it with students. We've got to do some advocacy around it as a school. We've got to support students doing advocacy around it. But we also, in the meantime, students need to pass those exams if they're going to be professionals. So I think that can actually help with passing exams if we acknowledge the racial biases that are in there and help students identify how to work with an exam that is racially biased, that the pass rates are racially biased. If we acknowledge, if we're not sort of gaslighting students basically and saying, no, it's a totally neutral and fair exam. It's just, that some races are passing it much less than others. If we acknowledge that it's actually got racial disparities and then build in opportunities to do advocacy and also help lead in advocacy and participate actively in advocacy as a school, that is really important.
On our school, the School of Nursing, we also added in ways for students to be a part of the committees that faculty and staff were on. So students had more voice. And I think also, like, for example, the student retention and recruitment committee, we were able to then see like student feedback, and they were able to participate in that process, and they found that helpful.
Great, thank you. All right, we're gonna have a couple more questions here. What advice would you offer to faculty who want to enact anti-racist pedagogy, but they're not sure where to begin, or they're nervous or about starting or getting it wrong? And sort of similar, let me add this other question. As someone who's new to anti-racist pedagogy, I'm afraid I might make mistakes that negatively impact my students. How have you recovered when you make a misstep?
So I can just really quickly begin. I think the part of this is what we've all been saying is start attending courses. I think the best place to start is with CTL in a lot of cases to understand what it means to use anti-racist pedagogy, what some of the strategies are. And I think we've all gone through these steps where we've made mistakes and we know we make them constantly. I know for me personally, using the word guys when you walk into the classroom, and I feel like I apologize multiple times in the classroom for using the word, and I still end up using it. But also recognizing that it's okay to say sorry and realize that you made a mistake. But starting with, there are a lot of resources out there. And I think, if this is something you really are invested in, just starting reviewing resources, attending some of these 1-hour workshops, and then maybe proceeding to attend a week-long workshop, and telling yourself you have to teach yourself. This is a new skill, and that's where we begin.
And I think it definitely connects back to what all of you mentioned throughout, right? This letting go of perfection and embracing being vulnerable and learning along with your students. So I think that's exactly right.
I guess I would just add, sort of making it manageable. You don't have to frame it in terms of redeveloping the entire curriculum, even if that would be a fantastic place to wind up. But it can just be something small, whether, based on the suggestions of the CTL, introducing something like a community agreement at the start of your sessions, or if there's some article that you're particularly interested or that really resonates with you and that you think might be useful, and having an organic or in-class, organic in-class discussion, something like that. So yeah, just focusing on ways to make it workable for you, in ways that feel authentic and real.
Thanks.
I'd also say you have to be used to feeling uncomfortable,
Mhm.
because it's not, you actually know you're making progress when there's the discomfort. So it's recognizing that there's going to be that level of discomfort that we feel. It's just natural to feel that, but learning and growing. And I think the students also have so much that they can teach us. So looking at the power dynamic in the class and trying to incorporate more student feedback.
That's a great tip. All right, this one's kind of a big one, so you might all have something to say about this one. Thank you for sharing your pedagogical approaches, considering that students respond in different ways, and some of you did mention that. How have these impacted student evaluations, especially with the role they play in tenure and promotion and reappointment for lecturers, I would add? Go ahead, Latisha.
But one thing we did was add this into our evaluation. So we wanted to have faculty be more aware of being, have more DEI and more anti-racist work. So it was added in as like objectives for the course to be evaluated on. So we now have a need to want to have that fulfilled. So faculty, I think, feel comfortable because it's part of the evaluation, because they're also trying to see like their own growth. So that has helped us. We do sometimes get, I think I take them with a grain of salt, like there's going to be students that are not happy. And we try to, understand where they're coming from, but we recognize that we can use the feedback that the students provide on the evaluation. We can grow from them. I haven't seen, for example, that it's impacted the ability to move on in terms of promotion. I think that the faculty are still doing an excellent job with trying to get the curriculum that we need to get done, in addition to adding the anti-racist. So I don't think it took away from the learning, but I think it is hard. I think that some people just feel more afraid to do it, and they're afraid of making a mistake. And that sometimes leads us to not want to do it.
I don't want to totally stick my foot in my mouth here, but I feel like, at some point it's probably more beneficial for evaluations than not engaging students in anti-racist pedagogy or in these kinds of conversations, just because it's something that students want. And the you can take it as an example, the case with the chemistry professor at NYU. Not to say that that was a just decision for the university. I don't know enough about it, but in that case, student perception was that the pedagogical approach was too regressive for what they were interested in. And so I think incorporating an anti-racist pedagogical methods, you're moving closer to what students expect and what students want. And I'd see it as being more of a liability not to include them.
All right. I think we will stop there. This was just fabulous. Thank you so much for all of these wonderful responses. I really appreciate some of the insights that you offered our audience. I think what I was hearing was this very intentional way of centering students, making space for the whole student, emotional, cognitive, physical, bringing their voices into the classroom. That was a very powerful theme. And I think that's something we can all take away from this. And to our attendees, thank you so much for joining us. And please reach out to us if you're interested in exploring anti-racist pedagogy in your own teaching. Thank you all.